Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
You ever sit through a family dinner so thick with passive-aggressive tension, so carefully choreographed in its emotional landmines, that you start to wonder if it's all some sick performance no one had the decency to tell you about? Last Sunday, around 5 in the evening, I found myself once again trapped at my mother's kitchen table, where the wine was cheap, the roast was dry, and the real main course was humiliation served cold. We were all there, Dad doing his usual disappearing act behind a newspaper that never changed, Samantha beaming like the second coming of Grace Kelly, Mom slathered in beige makeup and thinly veiled resentment. The air was already brittle with unspoken judgments when it happened. Mid-sentence, without a flinch or second thought, Mom let out a short, ugly laugh, leaned her elbow on the table like she was about to share a punchline, and said it. "You'll never be as pretty or successful as your sister." She said it like she was commenting on the weather or the quality of the potatoes, her voice bright and casual, like this was some universally accepted truth. Samantha snorted, more out of habit than cruelty, and covered her mouth like she didn't want to laugh, but she did. Dad blinked, paused for half a breath, and went back to pretending he couldn't hear. And I stared at her for maybe 2 seconds, 3 at most, long enough for the sting to register, for the silence to stretch, for the table to feel like a stage, and everyone on it complicit. Then I smiled. That's right, I smiled. The kind of smile you wear when the blade's already sunk in, and you know pulling it out won't stop the bleeding. I stood up, calmly reached across the table, began stacking the plates like a goddamn waitress, and walked them to the kitchen without saying a word. That's the thing about moments like this. They aren't born in a vacuum. You don't just break because someone cracked a joke. You break because that joke is the 100th cut, the final crack in a foundation that's been crumbling for years. You break because no one ever apologized for the 99 before it. As I rinsed the dishes and placed them carefully into the dishwasher, her dishwasher, in her pristine kitchen that always smelled like lemon and lies, I could feel her watching me. I didn't turn around, didn't give her the satisfaction of a flinch or a glance. Just finished the job and left. No door slam, no dramatic outburst. Just silence. That was the real message. And let me tell you, silence hits harder than any scream. Driving home was a blur. The sun was low, bleeding orange into the horizon, and the houses rolled past like ghosts of a life I'd never wanted. I didn't cry, didn't rage. I just drove. Hands steady, thoughts louder than the engine. What stuck with me most wasn't the insult itself. I'd heard worse from her, far worse. It was how casually she said it, like she truly believed it, like she thought that was her role in this family, the conductor of comparison, the queen of psychological warfare. And Samantha, she didn't even flinch. Of course not, she never had to. She was the golden child, the miracle, the one who got the private school and the surprise car on her 16th birthday. Meanwhile, I got the pep talks about working harder, trying more, losing weight, being grateful. She got everything handed to her with a ribbon on top. I got a mother who looked at me and saw every single one of her own failures staring back. But this wasn't the first time, not by a long shot. I remember the way Mom used to tilt her head when she looked at me as a teenager, like she was inspecting a flawed product on a discount rack. I remember when she told me, after I got into a state college instead of the Ivy League she bragged about for Samantha, maybe you should think about something more realistic. You've never been that academic. And I remember standing in the bathroom after she said it, gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white, trying not to scream because even then I knew it wouldn't change anything. So no, it wasn't just about Sunday dinner. It wasn't even about the sentence. It was about everything that came before and everything that still simmered beneath. A lifetime of being the other daughter, the spare, the one who existed only to provide contrast so Samantha could shine even brighter. And I had let it go for years. I had swallowed it all, every jab, every dig, every comment dressed as concern, because I believed keeping peace was more important than being right. But that dinner changed something, Or maybe it revealed something that had been sitting in me all along. The funny part, I didn't say anything. Not that night. Not until I was back home. I sat on my couch, looked at the unread text messages, the blank television screen, and that was when I knew. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to throw a fit or post some vague social media quote about toxic family. I just had to wait. Because sometimes the deepest cuts are the ones made with a whisper. The next morning, I got a text from Samantha. Just one line. "Mom won't stop crying. What did you say to her?" Now tell me, what do you think I said? The thing about being the second daughter, especially in a family where perfection is treated less like an aspiration and more like a demand, is that your role gets written for you before you've even had a chance to speak. You don't get to be the golden girl, the favorite, the one they parade at holiday parties with anecdotes about dance recitals and scholarships. No, your job is to stay quiet, to take the picture, to hold the bags, to nod politely when your mother explains to a neighbor how your sister's always been the driven one, the naturally gifted one, the beautiful one, while you were simply sweet or dependable or, God forbid, down to earth. That was me, Claire. The dependable disappointment. Even as a child, before I fully understood what it meant to be overlooked, I felt it in my bones, the way my mother's tone shifted when speaking to Samantha, the way her eyes softened when my sister walked into the room as though her mere presence brought light, while mine just occupied space. I remember birthdays where Samantha's gifts sparkled with brand names and glitter, while mine were more practical and modest, wrapped in recycled paper and handed over with a casual smile that never quite reached her eyes. I remember being 6 years old and watching as Mom held Samantha's chin in her hand, brushing hair away from her perfect little face and whispering, "You're going to be someone special one day." And thinking, without even knowing why, that she had never said anything like that to me. School only amplified the divide. Samantha was the kind of student teachers adored, bright, loud in the right ways, confident to a fault. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one in the corner, turning in assignments on time, never causing trouble, never demanding attention, and certainly never receiving it. When I brought home an A in science, Mom nodded and said, "Good," like I'd merely done what was expected. But when Samantha got a B+ in math, it was an event. A cause for celebration, a reminder of how hard she worked and how much pressure she was under. Dad noticed sometimes. I could tell by the way he looked at me across the dinner table, eyes lingering a second too long, lips pressed into a tight line, as if he wanted to say something but had long ago decided that silence was safer. There was one day, one moment, that burned itself into my memory so fiercely, I can still feel the sting of it when I close my eyes. Samantha was graduating from high school, top of her class naturally, and Mom had organized a backyard party with balloons and banners, and enough catered food to feed a wedding. I had just gotten my acceptance letter to a decent state college. Nothing fancy, but something I had worked hard for, quietly, without anyone's help. I showed the letter to Mom that morning, heart pounding with hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd say she was proud of me. She looked at it, blinked once, then said, "That's nice, Claire, but can we not bring this up today? Let's not take attention away from your sister." I stood there holding that letter like it was worth something, and nodded like it didn't hurt. But it did, it hurt so goddamn much I could hardly breathe. That moment crystallized something in me. Not resentment, not at first, but an understanding that I would never, ever be enough in her eyes, no matter how quietly I succeeded or how gracefully I endured. And Samantha, she never questioned it. She basked in the glow like it was her birthright, never once looking back to see who was standing in the shadows, making sure the light hit her just right. As we got older, the dynamics didn't shift, they just evolved. Samantha went on to a prestigious university, followed by a high-profile job in marketing that came with travel and brunch photos and the kind of lifestyle my mother bragged about to anyone who would listen. I worked in education, nothing flashy but meaningful, and watched as my mother pretended not to hear when I talked about my students, their struggles, their small victories. To her, success was measured in titles, income, and appearances. not in impact or integrity or the quiet dignity of helping others. The text from Samantha came the day after that dinner. I hadn't expected it, not really. Mom won't stop crying. What did you say to her? It was almost funny, in a twisted way. How quickly they'd noticed the shift in her, but had ignored every shift in me for years. What did I say? What could I have possibly said in those brief moments that unraveled her so completely? But of course, that question wasn't really about me. It was about her, about Mom, about maintaining the illusion that she was still in control, that nothing could crack her perfectly curated world of appearances. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit there, glowing on my screen like a dare. I thought about everything I'd wanted to say for years. How exhausting it had been to exist under the weight of their indifference. How many moments of joy I'd swallowed whole because I knew they wouldn't matter to her. How I had learned to find value in places she'd never look. I thought about how I could finally say it all, pour every ounce of truth into one long, cathartic reply. And yet, a part of me wanted to say nothing at all, because maybe the silence was finally loud enough. That night, I dreamed of standing in our childhood kitchen, watching a younger version of myself try to make cookies from a recipe torn out of a magazine. The cookies were burnt, the dough wrong, the timer never set. Mom stood over my shoulder, arms crossed, telling me I should have just let Samantha do it. In the dream, I didn't cry. I just looked at her and said, "You never learned how to love anything that wasn't perfect." And then I walked out the door, just like I did last Sunday. I woke up feeling a little lighter, not healed, not whole, but lighter. And still, I hadn't answered Samantha's text, because the truth, when it finally comes, has a weight of its own. And I wasn't quite ready to drop it, not yet. I've always believed there's something uniquely cruel about the predictability of family dinners, how they offer the illusion of routine, of comfort, of tradition, all while concealing a minefield of unresolved tensions, decades-old comparisons, and the kind of silent judgment that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be fully understood. Last Sunday's dinner wasn't unusual on the surface. It followed the same pattern we'd followed for years. My mother bustling around the kitchen with theatrical irritation, my father sipping flat beer and avoiding eye contact, Samantha floating in 20 minutes late with a story, a new piece of jewelry, and a wide smile that made everything feel like her stage. And I, of course, sat quietly, a prop in the backdrop of their familiar production, folding napkins, refilling drinks, pretending not to notice the script we'd all memorized by now. It was Samantha's latest promotion that kicked off the performance, a mid-level executive title that sounded important enough to impress our mother and vague enough to make me question whether any of it was real. She dropped the news like a bomb dressed as a gift, presenting it between bites of salad, letting her words hang in the air with the kind of casual grace that comes only from someone who has never been told no. "They finally made me director of brand strategy," she said, as if it had been inevitable, a natural next step for someone of her caliber. My mother clapped, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but with just enough fervor to communicate that this was, once again, the kind of accomplishment worth celebrating, worth pausing dinner for, worth making a toast. And she did toast, lifting her wine glass like a queen, anointing her air, her eyes fixed on Samantha, a flicker of pride dancing beneath layers of carefully applied makeup. "To Samantha," she said, smiling with the kind of pride I had stopped expecting to see directed at me. "Always our star." The glasses clinked. My father offered a quiet, almost reluctant congratulations. I sipped my drink, forcing a polite smile, wondering if it would ever occur to them to ask about my week, my job, my life. It was somewhere between the pork roast and the dessert that the moment came, not loud or explosive, but sharp and casual, as if it had been planned, rehearsed, folded into the meal like a bitter spice that only I could taste. My mother leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the edge of the table, and with that same wine-softened voice she always used when trying to sound playful, she let out a laugh and said, "You'll never be as pretty or successful as your sister." It wasn't the words themselves that stunned me. I'd heard variations of that sentiment for most of my life, but the delivery, the timing, the ease with which she let them fall into the middle of the table like an afterthought, as if they were some benign joke we could all laugh off. I don't remember if Samantha laughed first or second, only that she did laugh, softly, apologetically, the kind of laugh people offer when they don't want to seem cruel, but don't want to break rank either. My father froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, but he didn't look at me, didn't say anything, didn't interrupt the ritual. And me, I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't cry or shout or demand an apology. I simply stood, as calmly as if I were excusing myself to answer the phone, collected my plate, then reached across the table for the others, stacking them one by one with deliberate care. I could feel their eyes on me, confused, expectant, waiting for a reaction, but I gave them nothing. That was the power in it. I carried the plates to the kitchen sink, aware of every sound, the clink of ceramic, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant laughter from the dining room. And then, as I stood there with my back to them, staring out the window into the fading light of the backyard we used to play in as children, I spoke. Not loud, not angry, but clearly, just a few words, quiet enough that only she could hear, yet sharp enough that it sliced through the room like a scalpel. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I just said what needed to be said. I won't repeat it here, not because I'm ashamed, but because the words themselves aren't what mattered. What mattered was the effect, the way the air shifted, the sudden silence that felt like a curtain being drawn. The only sound that followed was the scraping of my chair. As I returned briefly to the table, grabbed my purse, and walked to the door. No hugs, no goodbyes. Just the creak of the floorboards beneath my steps, and the knowledge that I had, in one quiet moment, turned the script upside down. Driving home, I didn't replay the moment in my head, didn't dissect it for meaning or regret. I just let the silence settle, allowed it to stretch across the space like a blanket. I had finally said something real, something that couldn't be laughed off or rebranded as concern. It wasn't cruel, but it was honest, maybe for the first time in decades, and that honesty, that small act of truth, shook something in her. By the time I reached my apartment and kicked off my shoes, there was already a message waiting for me. Not from Mom, of course. She would never admit to being rattled, never acknowledge weakness, not directly, but Samantha had texted. Just one line. "What did you say to her?" And I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I realized something I hadn't quite known before. They had spent so long building a house of mirrors around themselves, so long ignoring the cracks, that a single well-placed truth was enough to make the whole damn thing shudder. And I hadn't even started yet. There's a peculiar kind of silence that comes after an emotional earthquake, the kind that doesn't settle so much as hover in the air like dust, fine and choking, clinging to every surface and refusing to be swept away, no matter how many times you run your hands across the mess. That's what it felt like the morning after the dinner. The stillness wasn't peaceful or relieving. It was thick, uneasy, and full of unanswered questions that hummed just beneath the surface of the everyday. I woke up earlier than usual, sat on the edge of my bed with my feet flat on the cold floor, and stared out the window at the street below, watching the slow trickle of normal life begin again. Joggers, delivery trucks, someone walking a golden retriever. But everything felt off-kilter, like the world had tilted slightly during the night, and I was the only one who noticed. The text from Samantha still sat unopened on my phone, glowing on the lock screen like a dare I wasn't quite ready to take. "Mom won't stop crying. What did you say to her?" 9 words that somehow felt heavier than all the years of silence I'd swallowed in that house. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know how to explain something so old and deep and layered without pulling the thread that would unravel everything they thought they knew about our family. It wasn't about the words I'd spoken. It was about the context behind them, the weight they carried, and the years of quiet observations that had turned into something solid, something sharp enough to finally cut through. The truth is, I hadn't planned to say anything that night. At least nothing more than the usual polite small talk and silent suffering I'd perfected over decades. But something shifted the moment my mother laughed, not just because of the insult itself, but because of how completely unaware she seemed of its impact, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to belittle one daughter to elevate the other. That level of detachment, that absolute certainty in her own righteousness, was the final crack in a wall I'd been leaning against for too long. And maybe what I said wasn't entirely about me. Maybe it was something I'd been carrying for years, tucked away in the back of my mind like a box you never open but never quite forget is there. It started with a letter, one I wasn't supposed to read, one that wasn't addressed to me, but that I found by accident tucked in the back of my father's desk drawer during a visit home 2 years ago. I had gone looking for a pen, something harmless, something routine, but instead I found a small stack of old envelopes bound with a rubber band, yellowing at the edges and brittle from time. I shouldn't have looked, I know that, but I did. And once you read something, once you know it, you can't just pretend you don't. The letter wasn't scandalous in the dramatic sense. There were no affairs, no betrayals, no hidden siblings, but it hinted at something unspoken, something raw and aching beneath the surface. It was from my mother, addressed to my father during the first year of their marriage, written in handwriting that was tighter and neater than the one I remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. In it, she talked about disappointment, not in him, but in herself, in the life she'd imagined and the one she ended up with, in the child she was pregnant with at the time, who she feared she wouldn't know how to love properly. She didn't say my name, but the date said enough. I read it once, then again, and then I folded it up, placed it back exactly where I found it, and closed the drawer like it had never happened. But from that day forward, everything felt different. Every cold glance, every backhanded compliment, every moment of favor shown to Samantha over me, suddenly they weren't just personal failures or overreactions. They were symptoms of something rooted in her own fear, her own grief, maybe even her own shame. And instead of feeling vindicated, I felt hollow. Because even knowing the origin didn't change the outcome. I was still the daughter she couldn't quite love, no matter how hard I tried to become someone else, someone better, someone worthy. So when I stood in that kitchen last Sunday, when I finally let the silence break and said the thing that cracked her wide open, I wasn't just speaking as the grown daughter who had been insulted over dinner. I was speaking as the child who had been silently waiting for acknowledgement, for an apology that would never come, for the truth to finally stand in the same room as all the lies we dressed up as tradition. I didn't quote the letter, didn't accuse her of anything. I simply made it clear that I saw her, not the version she played for neighbors or friends or even for herself, but the real one beneath all the control and pretense. And that, I think, is what broke her. Not rage, not cruelty, just recognition. A mirror held steady. Still, Samantha's message lingered. I knew her concern wasn't really for me or even for our mother's well-being. It was about control, about restoring the balance, about fixing whatever had gone wrong so that the performance could resume without interruption. She wanted me to explain it, to define it, to pin it down so it could be neutralized. But what do you say to someone who's lived their whole life in the spotlight when you've only ever known the shadows? How do you make them understand that sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else, and that what I said wasn't cruel but necessary? I didn't answer her that day. I went to work, I taught my students, I came home, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible, not because I had hurt someone, but because I had finally said something that mattered, and yet I could feel it, the pull of that moment, the unfinished nature of it, the sense that this was only the beginning of something much larger. There are truths we speak, and then there are truths we live with, the ones that linger in our bones and echo in our choices. And mine was finally making noise. There's a strange kind of calm that settles over you when the storm has already passed, not because everything is fixed or forgiven, but because something deep within has finally stopped pretending, stopped hiding, stopped performing for the sake of comfort and appearances and all the empty rituals that families cling to like lifeboats in a sea of dysfunction. In the days following that dinner, the silence from my mother was both expected and unfamiliar. It wasn't the sharp-edged silence she usually used to punish or control, the kind that made you squirm and second-guess every word you'd ever spoken. No, this was different. This was silence as surrender, and in some small, twisted way, that terrified them more than anything I could have shouted across that table. The text from Samantha had been sitting unopened for days now, blinking back at me every time I picked up my phone like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. "Mom won't stop crying. What did you say to her?" It wasn't curiosity, it was panic, thinly veiled as concern. And I understood that, more than she knew, because for people like Samantha, people raised to believe that truth is dangerous and appearances are everything, disruption feels like violence, even when it arrives in the softest voice, with the gentlest delivery. And I had disrupted the entire illusion, not with an outburst or a revelation, but by simply choosing not to play my part anymore. I finally responded on Thursday night after 4 full days of silence, not because I owed her anything, but because I needed to say something out loud, even if it wasn't everything. I typed, slowly and deliberately, "I just told the truth." Then I put my phone down, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the evening fall across the street like a blanket being pulled over the day. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't expect one. What was there to say? But Samantha, predictably, called the next morning. No text, no warning, just the ringtone and her name flashing across my screen like a final attempt to take back control of a narrative that had slipped out of her hands. I let it ring the first time, then the second. By the third, I picked up, not because I wanted to talk, but because I was done avoiding things. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What truth?" she asked, her voice tight, clipped, the words sharp with the desperation she was trying very hard to disguise as indignation. "She hasn't eaten, she's barely spoken. She says she doesn't know who you are anymore. What the hell did you say to her?" I took a breath, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of the pause. "Maybe it's not about what I said," I told her, slowly, clearly. "Maybe it's about what she finally heard." There was silence on the other end of the line. Not long, just enough. "Claire," she said finally, her voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and she'd broken Dad's wristwatch and lied about it, only to later confess in tears after 3 nights of sleepless guilt. "What are you talking about? You didn't... What did you tell her?" And here it was, the question, the one she had been circling since the moment I left that house. The fear that I had said something unforgivable, uncontainable, something so big it couldn't be unsaid. But the thing is, I hadn't revealed any secrets. Not really. I hadn't dragged the letter into the light or pointed fingers or accused anyone of anything they didn't already know, deep down in the places they refused to go. What I had done was simpler, more dangerous. I told my mother that the way she loved had always felt like punishment, that every compliment to Samantha had carried a shadow meant for me, that I had spent 30-something years trying to translate her silences into something resembling affection, and that I was tired. I told her that love given conditionally isn't love at all, that being tolerated is not the same as being accepted, and that I was done showing up for a performance where my role had already been written without my input. I didn't say it cruelly, I didn't shout. I just stood in that kitchen, hands still damp from washing dishes, and told her what it felt like to grow up invisible, and what it meant to finally see her, not as the mother she pretended to be, but as the woman she actually was, fragile, terrified, and incapable of facing her own disappointment in the life she ended up with. I didn't tell her she failed. I told her I understood why she did, and that somehow broke her. "I didn't lie," I said now into the silence of the phone call, and I didn't tell her anything she didn't already know. I just made it impossible for her to ignore. Samantha let out a sound, half breath, half sob. "Why would you do that?" And that right there was the difference between us. Because she still thought the silence was peace, still believed that keeping things hidden meant everything was okay. But I was done making myself smaller so that someone else's illusion could stay intact. Because I'm not the problem, I said. I never was. She didn't reply. Or maybe she did, but I had already pulled the phone from my ear, already let her voice drift into the static of distance and years, and all the unspoken truths we had inherited like bad jewelry. I stared out the window, the tea long cold now, the sky beginning to dim with the quiet promise of rain, and I felt still, not happy, not victorious, but still. There's something terrifying about finally being seen, not just by others, but by yourself, standing fully in your truth, knowing it might never be understood or accepted by the people who raised you, but deciding that your own peace matters more than their comfort. And maybe that's the real answer to the question that keeps circling. What did you say to her? Maybe I didn't say anything at all. Maybe I just stopped apologizing for existing. And maybe, just maybe, that was the loudest thing she'd ever heard.